During an era in which rock and roll was a predominantly male venture, the all-female rock group The Runaways released their debut single, Cherry Bomb, an appropriately rebellious anthem that came to represent the girls' nonconformity and rejection of the norms of their genre and society at large. In this sense, it was the perfect song to underscore the climax of 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy, a film about a group of unlikely, unlovable losers becoming intergalactic heroes. The final act of Guardians was really all about rebellion. Rebellion against the mad despot Ronan the Accuser, rebellion against the greedy, bloodthirsty Ravagers, but more importantly, like the Runaways, rebellion against the world and its expectations of them. In one of the most memorable scenes of the film, the Guardians choose to band together and risk their lives to stop Ronan's invasion of Xandar, and in so doing, perform their greatest act of rebellion yet, rejecting the hand life has dealt them and instead choosing to make their own destiny. Cherry Bomb is such a perfect musical supplement to the scene because earlier in the film we're introduced to these characters as self-interested individual outlaws with no code or identity. But as the lead vocals of Cherie Currie declare "Hello World" as the Guardians prepare for battle, it's as if each of our heroes is being reintroduced to the world. And this time, we see them not as Gamora, daughter of Thanos, Groot the homicidal talking tree, Rocket the science experiment gone wrong, Drax the vengeful destroyer, or Star-Lord the Terran with no home, but as one cohesive group, the Guardians. This scene represents a significant feature of what made Guardians of the Galaxy such a memorable film. From top to bottom, the filmmakers were intent on telling a compelling story using every tool at their disposal, including and especially an awesome soundtrack. But not just one that had good music, one that could serve as a living, breathing component of the film, as integral to the narrative as the main cast of characters. And it's a philosophy that was present from the very early days of the film's marketing. That now iconic first trailer for Guardians of the Galaxy way back in 2014 was not just a stroke of marketing genius, but an incredibly engaging, well-made piece of short-form storytelling. The guttural Native American-inspired chant of Blue Swede's Hooked on a Feeling was played expertly as a kind of percussive crescendo that gradually built up, carrying the visual action of the trailer up until its climax, when the chorus blares and the title floats on screen. Both the trailer and the film knew how to capitalize on their great story, characters, and visuals with great music, to maximum effect. And while all this was going on, someone somewhere at Warner Brothers was quietly taking notes. Because when the DCEU's own answer to the success of Guardians showed up 2 years later in the form of Suicide Squad, all the familiar beats were there from that very first trailer. If you go back and watch the first Suicide Squad trailer, you might be surprised about how well it still holds up. Queen's melancholic Bohemian Rhapsody, with its many heavy drum hits and its iconic guitar solo, served as a perfect complement to the fast-paced action of the trailer. It was incredibly well made and managed to capitalize on not just its wacky cast of characters and offbeat tone, but in the same way that Guardians had, took full advantage of a well-placed musical selection. But where Guardians was able to extend this philosophy to and through its final full-length feature, Suicide Squad failed to do so. I began this video discussing Guardians' Cherry Bomb scene because I think it perfectly demonstrates what the film did so well, incorporating its soundtrack in relevant, contextual ways that furthered the overall story. And whether it's David Bowie's psychedelic Moon Age Daydream playing during the entrance to Nowhere, or Elvin Bishop's dreamy Fooled Around and Fell in Love playing appropriately while Quill and Gamora begin to fall in love, the filmmakers knew how and when to use music to maximize their storytelling. Suicide Squad, on the other hand, had a much harder time finding that synergy between its soundtrack and its story, with the two oftentimes feeling in direct opposition to one another. There are so many instances in the film where the soundtrack felt so out of place that it made me wonder if there was any logic to when and where they deployed each song at all. Action Bronson's Standing in the Rain, whose lyrics include accusations of infidelity, boasting about embarking on exotic vacations, and other typical rap-centric topics, seems to add little to the flashback of Deadshot collecting one of his routine bounties. Creedence Clearwater's anti-war ballad Fortunate Son is somewhat randomly inserted over a scene of Killer Croc violently ripping apart a few prison guards. In all, the logic of the filmmakers seemed to be just pick a song that sounds cool without exploring any deeper connection to the story. And even when the songs are appropriately contextual, they're inconsistent with the actual on-screen action. Take, for example, You Don't Own Me, which for all intents and purposes is Harley Quinn's anthem. The song's lyrics are about a woman not wanting to be objectified and wanting to be her own person, yet the film resoundingly ignores that request. The song can be heard the first time we're introduced to Harley while she is dangling seductively from the top of her cell, wearing a ripped jumpsuit in the middle of the prison, being watched by all the guards while the trail end of the lyrics "Don't Put Me on Display" are literally playing in the background. A lot of these scenes actually had a fair bit of potential and could have been far more impactful had they been used in a more ironic fashion. In fact, ironic uses of songs can often be a great asset to improving the quality of a scene. Juxtaposing a song and a visual that have opposing emotional beats, cadences, or tones can often help in emphasizing certain characteristics of it. Guardians employs this method to create humor. An upbeat love ballad like Hooked on a Feeling, playing while the characters are at a low point in their journey, i.e. while they're being imprisoned and humiliated, helps make the scene more whimsical and entertaining. The same ironic juxtaposition could have engendered greater compassion amongst the audience for the characters in Suicide Squad. If, for example, Harley was being forced to entertain the prison guards for their pleasure and amusement, the use of You Don't Own Me would serve as a subliminal act of defiance against her captors. Instead, the film routinely shows us that Harley is simply a seductress who enjoys objectification, therefore making the song irrelevant to her character. Fortunate Son could have also been used in much the same way, allowing it to serve as a metaphor for how the squad are like soldiers being conscripted into a rich man's, or in this case, woman's, war against their will. Once again, though, the film shows us that most of the squad are ruthless killers and criminals, not conscientious objectors who abhor violence, El Diablo being one of the only exceptions. I imagine many people may not agree with this analysis and may think that these songs were actually meant to be used ironically, but I simply have a hard time believing that the film that brought us moments like these is capable of that kind of subtlety.
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
But whether played ironically or at face value, when music is used in either of these two films, it's Guardians that seems to know how and when to do so in a way that enhances the story. The best example of this is how the Guardians soundtrack supplemented one of its film's main themes, love. Between songs that either have the word love in the title, Fooled Around and Fell in Love, I'm Not in Love, Come and Get Your Love, or songs that are about love, Hooked on a Feeling, Go All the Way, I Want You Back, love is a consistent theme throughout the soundtrack and the film. And in this sense, it's the perfect soundtrack to convey the emotional journey that lays at the heart of the film, with three songs in particular, I'm Not in Love, Fooled Around and Fell in Love, and Ain't No Mountain High Enough, representing the beginning, middle, and end of that journey. Quill starts out the film rejecting love because of the pain associated with it. As someone who already didn't have a father, his refusal to take his mother's hand at the beginning of the film is not malicious, but rather representative of a young boy scared of loss. He believes that if he doesn't embrace his feelings, they won't be real, and therefore can't hurt him. In that sense, I'm Not in Love was the perfect song choice to introduce us to young Quill, affirming his intense desire to deny his true feelings. At the midway point, the film uses the song Fooled Around and Fell in Love during the scene where Quill and Gamora appropriately begin to fall for each other. It's the first time in 26 years that Quill is opening himself back up to the prospect of love. He demonstrates that those feelings are indeed real and not just pelvic sorcery by risking his life to save Gamora. Finally, the film ends with Ain't No Mountain High Enough, a song which affirms Quill's embrace of love and his commitment to protect it, no matter the obstacle in front of him. whether it's a tall mountain or a low valley. But what's most impressive about how Guardians used its soundtrack is that it gave the music actual significance within the narrative. In addition to its non-diegetic use, it's also physically manifested within the film in the form of the awesome mix, making it diegetic as well. In this way, the music was able to convey the same message to both the audience and the other characters in the film. The best example of this is the fooled around and fell in love scene. If this scene only had the music playing non-diegetically, only the audience would have the benefit of seeing Quill's growth as a character and understanding the significance of him giving Gamora the Walkman. But because he and Gamora are listening through the Walkman, it's able to serve as a much more powerful character moment where Gamora also learns something about Quill. Because both the audience and the other Guardians have already seen how protective Quill is of his Walkman, when he chooses to share it willingly with his new comrades, it demonstrates the sincerity of his emotions. In that moment between he and Gamora, he's not just giving her his Walkman, he's giving her a piece of his mother, and in that sense, a figurative piece of himself. The same thing happens at the end of the film. The audience can hear Ain't No Mountain High Enough, but so can the Guardians themselves, as Quill is playing it on the ship's internal speakers. Now, the whole team knows how Quill feels and understands that they are now his family. The Guardians soundtrack was able to give otherwise unfamiliar characters a relatable and heartwarming journey that made us root for them and conveyed the message that despite being mostly alien, in the end, they were really just like us. And unsurprisingly, that was director James Gunn's intention from the very early days of pre-production. He said, quote, "We're thrust onto a bunch of strange planets with strange landscapes, and the familiarity of the pop songs made it all a little more palatable. They simultaneously grounded us and provided a really fun juxtaposition." In contrast, the Suicide Squad soundtrack seemed to adopt the complete opposite methodology, choosing to reinforce how unrelatable and emotionally distant its characters were. From Eminem's Without Me to Kalani's Gangsta, the soundtrack seemed to convey a relatively consistent tone of aggressive animosity to the conventions of the outside world. Two of its flagship singles, Heathens and Sucker for Pain, are perhaps the worst offenders, with both being about a cliquish group of people rejecting conformity and being unwelcoming to outsiders. Whereas the Guardians soundtrack emphasized how its characters were loners not by choice, but by unfortunate circumstance, the Suicide Squad soundtrack reinforced that its cast were simply unpleasant people who wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. This wouldn't be such an issue if the film's story didn't directly contradict this presentation. If the film just presented the characters as straight-up bad guys with no remorse, morality, or emotion, it would at least be tonally consistent. But it instead insisted on trying, and mostly failing, to humanize its characters, giving them tragic backstories and having them refer to each other as a team and a family undeservedly.
I lost one family, I ain't gonna lose another one.
The resulting products were a film which made talking trees and raccoons more likable and relatable than a film about an actual group of humans. Ultimately, this discrepancy between the two film soundtracks really comes down to the creative philosophy that undergirded each production. From the very beginning, director James Gunn was intent on making the music integral to the film. Guardians' soundtrack was almost exclusively chosen in pre-production, with all but one of the songs that appear in the film having been decided before any filming had even begun. During the script writing process, he even created scenes based on songs, in addition to the more traditional method of choosing a song to fit a scene or an idea. On the other hand, Suicide Squad's soundtrack was assembled mostly in post. The film's music supervisor, Gabe Hilfer, noted in an interview with the LA Times that the crew would shoot the scenes, which were then screened for the songwriters and producers, who subsequently used them as inspiration to create the songs. Describing the overall process, Hilfer said, quote, "From the beginning, we knew this was an awesome opportunity to define ourselves with a big original song soundtrack. We said, let's find songs that match the significance and the size and the scope of the film." And I think that perfectly summarizes why Suicide Squad as a whole didn't work. From top to bottom, this production was about catching up to Marvel. It was about making a statement, something big and bold that would disrupt the industry. It's why they corralled some of the biggest names in music to contribute to the soundtrack. Most of their musical decisions seem to boil down to little more than, hey, that sounds cool. And truthfully, yes, it did sound cool. It's not that the soundtrack was bad by any means. Suicide Squad's failings as a film aren't because of the failings of its soundtrack. The failings of its soundtrack are because of the failings of the film, and the entire methodology behind its production. Where its soundtrack did work, it was actually where they used pre-existing music as opposed to the original ones. Slippin' Into Darkness was a perfect fit for El Diablo's introduction that represented his character's battle with his inner demons, and Eminem's Without Me did a decent job of likening the tenuous relationship between the Squad and Amanda Waller to that of the relationship between Marshall Mathers and the entertainment industry in his heyday, one where both reluctantly needed the other. But these moments were the minority. It's almost as if the allure of creating a new, statement-making original soundtrack obscured the larger goal of creating a compelling story first. The juxtaposition between these two competing films serves as an informative case study on what can happen when all the various components of a story, from the visuals to the narrative, and even the music, are synergized as one, and when they are not. The difference between these two soundtracks is representative of two very different philosophies, one that treats certain aspects of the storytelling process as an afterthought, and one that treats every aspect as being integral to crafting a compelling narrative. That kind of multi-layered storytelling can be the difference between stories that leave a lasting cultural imprint and those that are quickly overwritten and forgotten. Or in other words, the difference between the stories that don't say much of anything and the ones that say something. Hi everyone, if you got this far, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This content is a little bit different than what I've done in the past, but musical analyses are something that I've wanted to do since I basically started the channel. It's just a little bit difficult to do because of YouTube's copyright system, but I do hope to do more of these type of videos in the future, hopefully incorporating more music theory into the analyses as well. So I hope that that's something you would all be interested in, and obviously if it is or isn't, certainly leave a comment, like, etc. Let me know. On another note, I'd like to say thanks for 500 subs. It really does help the channel grow, and I'm glad to see some people are enjoying the content. I can't really upload as often as maybe some other channels because YouTube just isn't my full-time job, but I do try and balance out the lack of quantity with, hopefully, quality videos that you guys will enjoy. So with that being said, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.